So, welcome to episode 2 of Under the Pallet Wrap with Dan Culverhouse and me, Keith Dupres. A podcast about supply chain. Not necessarily for supply chain people. Hopefully, it'll be interesting to everybody who works in e-commerce, logistics, and industry in general. And every week, we take a question, one simple question related to supply chain, and we mull it over, and it takes us into all different directions. No script, no agenda, just general discussion, and hopefully some good insights. Last week we talked about our experience up to now, our careers in supply chain, some of the challenges we faced. Today we want to go a little bit deeper into the subject, and our question today is, what is supply chain? Where does it begin and where does it end? So I think people would have different opinions on this one, Dan. What do you think? Where do you think supply chain starts?
Well, yes. So it's not an easy question to answer, actually, is it? I mean, it sounds like, oh well, it starts at the beginning of a product and it ends when it lands at a consumer, right? But actually, there is so much more to it, and a lot of it, I think, depends on the perspective that you're looking at it from. Are you a consumer? Are you the retailer? Are you a distributor, manufacturer, a supplier? And I think all of those would describe the supply chain a little bit differently. If you're the retailer, it starts with where you buy it, and it ends when somebody sells it to you. And then, of course, you start talking about the returns, so it gets a bit more complicated again. And I think, but probably a good way to probably focus this in, because otherwise we'll just go round and round in circles, is to consider it from a product perspective, as opposed to, so we're not worried about who we are, it's a product. So I don't know, why don't we take a blue printed t-shirt or something, and start to look at it, from that perspective. If we go up the supply chain, where does the supply chain start if you're a t-shirt? Of course, you don't become the t-shirt until you've been made, but the supply chain starts before it's been made. So you can go up to the raw materials, and of course the raw materials are multiple supply chains because there are multiple raw materials, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I would go so far as it starts with design.
I guess that's the trigger, right? So the design is the thing that will trigger a supply chain. Because I think, certainly from my perspective, the supply chain is the physical aspect. For me, it's not the thinking about it; it is the physical aspect. But you're right. The trigger is a design. So you have to design something, and then that turns into its component parts, I guess, doesn't it?
I think you put it really well, actually, Dan. When the physical movement of the stock begins. But would you say that it's essential to have the supply chain having an input or being at the table when it comes to the design decision? We're responsible for the movement, but how important do you think supply chain is to the decision that actually influences the steps that come next?
Well, I'm trying not to sound cynical here, but history would say it certainly can happen without supply chain's involvement at the start, because it's certainly a regular occurrence. I'm sure most people who've been involved in supply chain would say, well, of course it would make it better, but we're not always asked. So quite often we have to react and respond. But without a doubt, if you involve some supply chain and logistics elements into your design process, then the product will probably be a better product. It would also, no doubt, be more cost effective to create, manage, and move. And you could just take something really simple as an example. And that is that when you build your product, and as I say, if we keep to the blue t-shirt scenario, so when you pack it and you put it into boxes and a number of items per box, etc., etc., and it ends up palletized. If the supply chain and the logistical people are involved, then that box will fit on a pallet with no wasted space, and therefore, as it moves through a supply chain, it will be, efficiently packed. So there's no air, there's no wasted space within a pallet or in a container. You use that, modular type approach, and that's just a very simple example of where, that practical operational supply chain view at an early stage can make a significant impact on the cost and the effectiveness of that movement, of that supply chain.
We're going to suggest that it starts at the first physical movement of the goods. Is that what we've determined between us?
Yeah, but I guess goods means raw materials at this stage, so it's not a t-shirt yet, but it's the component parts that will make up that t-shirt. And you could even start to say, well, included in that has to be then the machinery that creates that product, because it's all very well having a bunch of cotton and some dye and some print, but if you don't have a machine or a sewing machine to create it or cut it, you can keep going forevermore, right? You can say, oh well, the raw materials are the cotton. Well, that cotton has to get picked off a plant at some point, and at some point someone has to plant that plant, so it starts with a seed. But we could go on forever, right? But from a practical sense, let's say we start with the raw materials, which are things like cotton and dye and things like that. So those component parts have to come together somewhere, so it can be turned into a t-shirt. I would say that was where we would be the start point from this perspective. So because if you have your idea, your design, from there you buy your component parts, right, and then you bring them in, and that physical aspect, that movement, starts with the cotton coming to the manufacturer to be made, to be cut, and to be sewed.
So what are the pressures that someone in supply chain is facing?
I think the first and obvious one is quantities, right? How many should I make? How many should I make of what size? And then it's, well, if I'm making those, then how many should I put into each box of each size? Should I just make single size boxes? Should I make ratio packs with a selection of sizes across it? So I think these are some of the key questions that somebody has to ask early on in the process. So, because it's all very well saying you've got this great t-shirt, but who's going to buy it? Where's it going to be sold? How many different sizes do I need? And then which will be the most popular? It's immediately a complicated question.
Absolutely. This is where supply chain have to collaborate very closely with merchandising. I think it's sometimes a surprise to logistics teams that how big a stakeholder buying and merchandising actually are. Time to market, the cost, absolutely everything impacts the whole buying process. The two teams collaborate so closely, but I've worked in lots of operations where the buying team were almost unknown to the supply chain team. But I think we both expressed the key point there. How much do you need? How many products are you shipping? When do they need them by?
Yeah, and of course, in the past, that's kind of been really a little bit of just a financial discussion, right? Because you want to make enough so you can sell them and maximize your revenue, but you accept that you won't sell all of them, and some of them will be left. But interestingly, we're in a place now, I think in the next few months, isn't it, that certainly in the EU, that manufacturers can no longer destroy product they don't sell. And I think that puts even more pressure on that early decision-making process about how much of this do I buy, how much do I make? Because if I make 1 million of them and I only sell 600,000, I can no longer include in my margin the cost of destroying or recycling or repurposing. Well, recycling and repurposing will still be okay, but you can't. I mean, we've seen the waste that particularly the fashion industry suffers with. So that there's an additional new pressure that's coming on getting that question right from the beginning.
Absolutely. Designing products, go back to designing products that have a longer life cycle that can feed into the circular economy, can be turned into something new straightforwardly, is a whole new element to the apparel industry. So again, it goes back to that planning stage, doesn't it? So after manufacturing, which obviously brings about so many individual pressures and margins and, and cost inputs. What about the next stage? Would you say wholesale?
Yeah, so I guess you get into movement then. Right? It's like you could have to some degree a pretty direct supply chain. So you could have a manufacturer that sells directly to a retailer, and then the retailer sells to the consumer. But very commonly, a part of that chain will be a wholesaler, a distributor. So somebody who buys that t-shirt in bulk, and then they do the job of finding retailers around the world, realistically, to sell in bulk that product to. So a manufacturer may have a relatively simple job of creating it, and then selling it to major players and then wholesalers. So their outlets are somewhat limited. They wouldn't ever sell to the consumer, for instance. But of course, you're then into international shipments, because almost inevitably you're not selling the product in the country that you manufacture it. Right? I mean, let's be realistic when we're talking fashion. A big location for fashion manufacturing would be somewhere like Bangladesh. The demand for clothing in Bangladesh is not going to support many of those countries. It has to be a global demand. So immediately you're into big international shipments around the world.
So what sort of skill sets come into play when it comes to international shipping? You've got demand and planning, but then you've also got trade compliance, which is a whole
Yep.
different ball game. A little bit different to, some people think logistics is all about warehousing, but it's a whole different skill set, getting goods from A to B. What sort of skills do people need to ship goods internationally, especially in the current climate?
Well, I want you to answer this. This is your game. I am the warehouse guy, so this is yours, my friend. Before I get it wrong, I want you.
Well, I've always gone by the three simple rules, really. So what is it? Where's it going? And when does it need to be there by? Uh, it might seem simple, but in asking those three questions to yourself, you get into the world of product compliance. Like what is it? Where is it? Where are you now? And what do you need in order to sell those products, not just domestically, but in international markets? There's never been more requirements for products than there are now. There's tariffs. We hear a lot about tariffs, but there's also non-tariff barriers to protect local industry, managed by things like standards. The EU has just adopted the general product safety requirements. Sadly, the UK, in leaving the EU, are not involved in those discussions. So there's new obligations for UK suppliers wishing to ship to the EU. But yeah, so the product, like, what is it? What am I trying to ship? The higher risk, the more standard supply. Risk can involve physical safety elements, but also security. So phones are subject to not just one regulation around safety and catching fire, but also the data within. Um, in terms of where, just what it is, like what size is it? Um, are there regulations for import whereby you need to satisfy them before you ship? How can you ship them by air? Are they big? Are they small? Are they fragile? And where you're shipping to, what's the economy like? What's the situation in the country? Is every country's different. And if you look culturally and economically, it, I find this very fascinating. It can give you a few clues about what sort of restrictions might be in place or how easy or hard it might be to ship a product to a destination. So, if you consider something like a phone, can you ship it absolutely everywhere? Or is it likely that each individual country will have a different approach to the electronics industry? Do they manufacture it, this type of product in their own country? Do they not? Do they import most of their products? That will often give you a clue as to whether the duty rate's going to be high or whether there's going to be additional restrictions or requirements.
And I guess a lot of that is determined by, are you a consumer market or are you a production market? Right? So the big producers of this world have a very different perspective on this than the consumer market. So if you're the EU or the UK, we're a large consumer market, not a large manufacturing market. And I think the one that's probably had the most headlines over recent years has been Chinese EVs, right? Electric vehicles that Europe feels the Chinese are importing into our market undervalued because let's say the Chinese government is alleged to be subsidizing the cost of the manufacture so they can sell them across the world at ridiculously low prices that nobody in Europe can compete with. Are they, or are they just efficient at what they do? I don't really know. I couldn't answer that question, but it would certainly, it looks very much like there's a lot of subsidizing that's going on because the Chinese are a manufacturing nation and therefore they support their manufacturers. So you get it, right? You can see why they do it. What does that mean? Of course, that means that the EU will put levies and anti-dumping tariffs on. I mean, I think it's up to 50%, isn't it? Some of the EVs got charged with on some of the companies, depending on, I guess, probably depending on connections. But I didn't say that. But depending on how much subsidies they believe is happening at the manufacturing end, which is another huge complication to understand. When you're bringing product across the world.
Yes, we hear a lot about the US trade deficit and the tariffs that have been designed to claw some of that money back. But I think your point is very clear. I mean, if you're importing as a consumer for goods that you want rather than need, then the whole tariff nomenclature is based upon lower tariffs generally for raw materials and higher tariffs for consumer goods. So to look at things as a flat picture and we're paying tariffs on this and that is not actually in keeping with the manufacturing bases of the world and the consumer bases of the world. It was designed by that. It designed to service.
Yeah, to create balance. Because it's a balance between creating an open market, a sense of competition, because if you do, or you can have a sense of protectionism. So if you want to protect your local industry, you make sure that every imported product, car in this instance, has enough tariffs on it to make sure that it's expensive and therefore it favors your local. But again, the design was to find balance, but it's now a political tool. Right? I mean, it's used politically a lot these days, rather than just trying to find the balance between local trade and imported trade, competition, choice for people. It's to a large degree, it's a political weapon these days, as which we have seen more in the news around tariffs. I think more people in the world know what a tariff is these days than ever before.
Absolutely, certainly more so than ever before. When I've trained my teams around things like classification, I always start with the international trade question and why tariffs, HS codes, classification rules came to be post World War II in order to avoid any sort of conflict of this nature happening again. I think the history is important to understand the context. Um, so there's probably been a few groans when I've started talking about GATT agreements and the birth of the WTO. The team was sitting there thinking, what is he talking about? But I think they've always valued the background to understand why a system came into play, why things like free trade agreements came to be, how they work, how, in effect, before a few years ago, there were so many more conversations about reducing trade barriers, promoting free trade. It's all gone in reverse a bit. It adds a completely new complexity to supply chain staff, their day to day. It shows the absolute importance of being knowledgeable and understanding the effects of these decisions, and being able to offer an input into those decisions about where the goods are made and how they're made and how they're shipped.
And the risk that's attached to that, right? I mean, because, historically over the last 20, 30 years, it's really been this globalization of product manufacturer demand and supply. But in probably the last 5 years, maybe a little bit more, you started to see a turn away from that kind of global market. I think the COVID pandemic started it, when obviously everything just ground to a halt, and suddenly people realized, well, all my products in China, but my sales are in Europe. I now can't ship anything, and now I've got nothing to sell, and my business is going down. So suddenly the need for a more nuanced approach to the supply is born. Then suddenly you can't just go for, right, well, it's cheapest to manufacture it in China. The shipping costs don't even touch the overall cost. So I'm just going to have everything in deepest China, so I can buy it for 2 cents a piece and sell it for £30 in the UK, and that shipping cost is minute as a percentage of the overall. So suddenly thinking, well, that's great when everything's working, but when we go to war and the main route through to Europe is blocked, I've got no product. So suddenly this multi-sourcing of having a near shored solution as well as a global solution, so which may well be more expensive, but if you're doing, say, I don't know, 10-20% of your volume manufactured in Europe and the other 80% in Asia, at least you have a chance if there's a blockage or a carrier ship that gets stuck in the Suez Canal. I mean, who would ever thought that would happen? But it did. And you can be starved of your stock suddenly. But if you have some of that product being manufactured in Europe, which is probably considerably more expensive to produce, so you have to kind of balance that in there. So, and I think that's made that supply chain planning, that merchandising, that design upstream even more complicated today than it used to be, because global disruptions are happening more than ever before. It's become the norm that we work within.
Absolutely. So much talk about AI replacing jobs, but I don't think supply chain's ever been busier.
Yeah,
reclassification, uh, planning again, moving distribution centres,
we
sometimes within the
welcome
space of a
AI.
week.
We welcome
Yeah.
AI to give us a hand, right?
Oh, everyone's begging for some AI to save their time at the moment, but um, it can't move quick enough. So yeah, I think a lot of people working in warehouses even would be amazed that, I think they were always a bit amazed about what my team did behind the scenes in order to get the goods from A to B, even when it was simpler. But I also think people simplify what happens once the goods arrive, once they get to the warehouse door. Um, I
Yeah,
think some people think they magic themselves to the customer, but there's a whole load of processes that happen from the moment the goods arrive. I mean, the collaboration between the import export team and the warehouse is massive anyway, in order to help them resource by giving them visibility of what's coming in when.
yeah.
What happens once the goods arrive at the door?
And again, various products will vary what happens. You can take the simplest, which is if you have total control over your supply chain and you have a very steady demand, you can effectively use your warehouse as simply a point of bringing in bulk and distributing in small quantities to your customers. And there are products and there are operations that do that on a completely stockless environment. So it comes in the morning, it's received, it's understood, it's checked, goes through a quality process, and is then split, distributed into, let's say, shops, locations, packed, and out the door the same day. So it never sits in stock. Um, Sometimes it's quite common these days because of the globalization of our supply chains that you bring products, say, into the UK, but only a portion of it is ever going to get sold in the UK. Some of it will get re-exported. And then we get into bonded customs warehousing where you only bring officially into the UK what we would call free circulation, the products that you know you're going to sell in the UK. The rest you hold in what they call a duty suspension, which allows you to then re-export it to another country and pay the duties in that country. So you're not paying the duties in the UK and then paying the duties in another country, which is another additional complexity, which is only a systemic complexity these days. It used to be a physical segregation. You used to put a cage around your bonded stock so nobody could go in there, whereas nowadays it sits on the same pallet in the same location. It's just systemically split. So there's a complication. Many products need to have labeling done to them before they can go out. Tagging, promotional pricing, rebagging. There's a world of value added services that can be done to a product whilst it's in a warehouse. All of these things happen inside of a warehouse. And then, of course, the way that you distribute out of a warehouse is also very, very varied. Exports can be in bulk, but they can also be to the consumer, so single items. The explosion of online and e-commerce means now that you're not just picking full cases and sending them to shops for the shops to sell to the customers. The warehouse is effectively delivering to customers these days. So you then have to go through picking by case, but also picking by single units and shipping those beautifully packed. So if it's a relatively luxury item, the packing can be a real art form, which means multiple types of boxes, multiple types of packaging. The risk of error becomes much higher. Within a warehouse itself, the amount of complexity that can go through it. And when you think, a professional large-scale warehouse can be shipping millions of units in a week, and the expectation is that they will go out with a 99.5 plus percentage of accuracy, is an enormous task, which is why automation and robotics has become such an explosion within warehousing, because it makes less errors. It doesn't replace people. It certainly manages the volatility of people because, of course, particularly in retail, warehousing is a very volatile environment from a demand perspective because if you promote a lot of products or you go into a high promotional period, Christmas would be the most obvious one, you can see volumes more than double. I mean, it's not, you go through a Black Friday, if you're an e-commerce, you can see thousands of percentage of demand increase over a very short space of time, which traditionally would be done by just tripling your staff. Well, if you've ever worked in a warehouse and you run a group of individuals that are picking orders, processing orders, if you suddenly get 3 times as many people who've never done it before, you've got a lot of problems on your hands and a lot of accuracy issues and a lot of compliance issues. So this is where the automation and robotics has really helped to limit the amount of short-term labor. So you're always needing that core skill set of people that really understand how the process works and how to manage orders, but you use machinery and robotics to drive that volume. So yeah, they're hugely complex operations these days and very expensive.
Yes, we not only do we have picking, we have packing, the consistency of the packing, and the massive area of waste with
Yeah, yeah,
packaging. When there's too many component parts, there's too much space. Obviously, the bigger the box, the higher the shipping cost. Um, so someone's monitoring that as well. Someone is always reviewing the packaging costs. Someone's always reviewing the shipping costs. Someone's, of course, always reviewing the transit times, the delivery success. You're working with multiple carriers sometimes to distribute the risk and customers demand service as well, demand choice. So you're managing lots of carrier relationships. Some are tracked, some are untracked. You get a number of inquiries from different departments, customer service, asking about um, where's my order, why is this delayed, what's happening here. And of course, you've got that relationship with the carrier manager, and you're finding that information out for the whole business. Obviously, the closer relationship you have with internal departments and the carrier manager, the easier you make it for everybody. You take a continuous improvement approach. You take the requests and the complaints that you get, and you aim to reduce them by improving the service. But I've been amazed the amount of warehouses I've been into and the amount of businesses I've been into where, again, they think that part is almost magic. The courier collects the goods, regardless of what address has been added to the or applied to the shipping label, and it's going to get there in one piece. Everything's perfect, but there's so much that comes into it, and making sure that those deliveries get out on time, get delivered on time, get resolved before the customer even knows about the issue. All sorts can go wrong. Then, of course, the bugbear of the e-commerce world is returns. It's a given, really. When I started out in e-commerce, people thought it might not work because of the returns element. How are you going to build a big business when people like to return their goods? Well, they were right in a way. It's always been a huge cost for e-commerce businesses in certain fields, less so in some. But of course, returns have to be managed seamlessly as well. They have to be managed back through customs if they're international shipments,
yeah.
customs regimes, duty free. Again, it doesn't happen by magic. Processes have to be established, and aftercare as well.
Yeah, I think the whole returns piece. I think it's a really interesting position. So as e-commerce and direct to consumer distribution has grown and grown and grown, and in fashion and clothing and really consumable items like that, we're talking about a level of returns that are 40 and 50% is not unusual. I was talking to someone just this morning that was telling me that through their Zalando, which is a big European marketplace, their returns were close to 70%. Now, just think about the cost and complexity of managing that process. And alongside that, right now, we have a consumer that is demanding quicker deliveries. They want free returns. All of these things are huge pressure on a retailer's and a manufacturer's margins to be able to deliver. So we want cheaper products. We want them delivered instantaneously. We want to be able to send 50% of them back when they don't fit. And on top of that, we want you to be environmentally friendly. We want you to be sustainable. And e-commerce and the level of returns is the biggest driver of inefficiency and environmental impact in the supply chain. And I think there's technology is going to help with this, because we have to be able to get better at ordering the right product. So don't order size 9, 10 and 11 shoes just to check. We need to find a way that technology can make sure that actually I know I need the 11s and I only order the 11s, and that somehow that you can picture yourself in the black ones as well as the blue ones as well as the red ones, so you don't order all 3 colors and send 2 of them back, because it's just not a sustainable practice going forwards. I think that we have to find ways to stop this belief that you can just order 5, 6 different items and send 4 of them back.
Absolutely. There's some very exciting developments as we speak. This is where AI is benefiting.
It really is.
Supply chain very much. And with the regulations coming in place sooner than people realise, at the beginning of 2027 for textiles, you're forced into action, which is a big ask of retailers, to actually be forced to manage the environmental element alongside the convenience.
Because ultimately, it's just going to push the price of the product up, right? It has to. It has to push the. Unless the approach and retailers can, I don't know, influence their customers to recognise that the only way to keep pricing under control is to change the way that we shop and the way that we consume. It'll just become unsustainably expensive, because companies can't do it without making a margin. They have to make a profit, otherwise they can't afford to keep going. And I think that there's only one future, and that is more responsible consumerism. And recycling, repurposing, making sure that those unsold items do get into the market, whether they're debadged or sent to an area where they don't dilute the brand's exclusivity or something like that. But all of these things have got to happen, because I think we're on a path that is not sustainable.
There's a concept in Six Sigma called poker yoker, which is essentially mistake proofing, but it can also be looked at as prohibiting the customer from doing the wrong thing. So a lot of that can be built into the design, in my view, into the shopping experience. So, like you say, the customer can't order 10 units of the same thing.
Yeah.
But you also don't want them to drop off at the checkout. So a lot of innovation is needed. It's what keeps me excited, this constant adaptation and innovation in the supply chain. I think it's what's always kept me so interested. It's very because of the cost element and the fact that it's normally the highest cost. It's normally the most visible cost, because we're judged on cost. There's also a lot of innovation, continuous improvement in making sure quality is maintained whilst keeping costs at a minimum, or not sacrificing quality for cost, knowing what value is. Cheap does not mean less money, scheme of things.
Yeah. Interestingly, to almost to circle this round into that where we started with this question about where does the supply chain start and finish. I think this part of the discussion where we talk about recycling and repurposing of product, this is ultimately feeding the end product in some form or another back to the start of the supply chain. So clothing can get broken down into its raw materials, or products get broken down to raw materials, and they end up right back at the start being recreated into new products. So it's almost
absolutely,
the supply chain doesn't even have a beginning and an end. It is becoming a circle. And there are lots of wastages and that drop off around, but effectively the supply chain is actually a circle.
It's an eternal chain, hence its name. I think we might have a year ago suggested the end, sadly, was landfill in a lot of cases. But I'm so glad that this is
I think,
no longer acceptable in the eyes of the world, and it's a lot more visible. And I'm glad the focus is on almost eternal life cycle.
Yeah, it has to be the future, right? But okay, well, I think we're probably at a good spot to go. Let's leave that there. Lots to think about. One thing I think that we've shown without any shadow of a doubt is this thing is complicated. It's complex and very nuanced. So hopefully there's been a whole bunch of things for people to go away with, to think about, to consider, and maybe even to focus on in their roles or in their businesses. But I think the only thing we can all agree on is it's a very complicated thing. But I think for this week that's a pretty good place to finish. We're going to be back again next week talking about something new. And I think, Keith, we've decided it's going to be, what is a warehouse for? And is a distribution centre the same thing?
Yeah.
Agreed?
Yeah. Indeed. See you next time.
Yeah. Thanks. See you next week.